All right, now we're going to build the plans block. This one is pretty easy, and I want you to do it as an exercise. Now, before you get started, let me give you a couple of hints. On desktop, the popular plan should be slightly larger than other plans. And also, when we hover over any of these plans, I want the plan to get slightly larger with a nice transition. With all that, spend 5 to 10 minutes on this, then come back see my solution. So back to our markup, we're going to start a new section with two classes, block and container. Now, inside this section, we're going to have a grid. So a grid, well, a 3-column grid. So here's the second class. Good. Now we need to grab the template for our plans. So let's pull up plans.html, copy this entire code and paste it right here. So here's our plan markup. I'm going to remove this class because the first plan is not the popular one. Good. Now we need to add another plan. So down the end, look, we have so many divs. We don't know which div is representing what. So we can click on this div. Now on the top over here, we can see the opening div. So this is the div that represents a plan. Now right after this, we can paste another plan. This is the popular one. So we're going to keep this class, but I'm going to change the skin for this card from secondary to primary so we get that medium blue. We should also change the skin for this badge to primary. Good. Now one last plan. So here's the end of the popular plan. Great. Now we're going to paste another plan and we should remove this class as well. Good. Let's see what we have up to this point. So here's the mobile version. It looks great already. The only problem I see is that these cards or these plans are so close to each other. We can solve this problem by applying a gap to our grid. So back to our markup, I want to quickly jump back to our section without scrolling up and down. So look, here's our section. Let's click on this. Then we select it here. And our cursor is right at the section element. So I'm going to give this an extra class called block-plans. Now back to our style sheet. We define a new section called plans block. And then add a rule and say, in the block that is called plans, our grid should have a gap of 4 rems. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm naming these classes in the reverse order, so over here we are saying plans block, but the name of the class is block plans. Why is that? Well, with this convention, we can see all kinds of blocks. So here we have block plans. Later on, we're going to create another block called features and so on. Okay. So we applied a gap. Now let's take a look. So we have some space here. That looks great. Now on mobile, we don't want to make this card larger because it's going to pop out of the screen. Doesn't make sense. So I believe the mobile version is done. Now let's look at the tablet version. So look, that doesn't look good. We don't want a card that is so wide. So on tablets, we want to make the card a little bit smaller and then put it right in the center. Now there are 2 ways to solve this problem. We can write a media query for this card and set the width property, but there is another solution. Back to our style sheet, we can define a new rule and say, in this block, our cards should have a max width of, let's say 500 pixels. Now take a look. That is better. With this, we don't have to write a media query. So our cards are never going to stretch beyond 500 pixels. If the screen is wider, nothing is going to happen. Well, we get the 3-column layout, which we're going to talk about in a second. But if you go to mobile, the size changes dynamically, but no more than 500 pixels. Great. Now, to put this in the center, once again, we're going to assign auto to horizontal margin. So back to this rule. Here we set margin to 0 auto. Take a look. Good. That looks great. Now there's one issue here. Look at this badge. It's lost because we're using the same background color for the badge and the card. So where should we fix this? Where is the right place to do this? Well, early in the course, we added this rule in the card section. So here we are saying in secondary cards, if you have a secondary badge, its background should be slightly different. With this, anywhere we put a secondary badge inside a secondary card, our badge is going to have the right color. So we don't have to repeat this style all over the place. So we're going to take the same approach. Here in the card section, I'm going to define another rule and say, if we have a primary card, and in this card we have a primary badge, the background should be 126DE4. Now take a look. So the problem is gone. Beautiful. So the tablet version also looks great. Now what about desktop, laptop or desktop? So the layout works fine. We just need to make the popular plan slightly larger. So back to our style sheet, in the section for styling our plan components, earlier we defined a rule for popular plans. Now we're going to define a new rule and say, if you have a plan that is popular, it should be slightly larger. So here we can use the transform property and scale this to 1.1, so 10% larger. So I'm applying this rule here generally to all popular plans, whether they are in the plans block or not. So once again, this is object-oriented CSS in action. We want to separate content from container. So we don't want to make this larger only in this block, because if you have this plan or another plan that is popular in another block, then we'll have to make that plan larger as well. So let's see if this works. Back to the browser. Our popular plan is larger. Great. The last thing we need to implement is the hover effect. So once again, in the plans section, down the bottom, before our media query, I'm going to write our hover stats. So if you hover over a plan, once again, I want to scale it to 1.05, so 5% larger. Now look, okay, this is working. Now if you hover over a popular plan, it becomes smaller because initially we scaled this by 10%, but when we hover over it, we scale it by 5%. So we need a second rule for the hover effect on popular plans. So I'm going to grab this rule and duplicate it, and then change the class to plan popular. And here we're going to use a larger value, so 1.15. Now take a look. So that works perfectly fine, but the transition is so sudden, so let's smooth it using the transition property. So back to the plan section, I'm going to define a new rule for all plans, whether they're popular or not. And here I'm going to set the transition property to transform 0.2 seconds ease out. So I'm applying this transition across the board to all plans, whether they're popular or not. Let's save the changes and see what we get. Now we have this beautiful transition. I love it. Let's just make sure that this works on a small screen as well. So I'm going to make the browser smaller. Now you might argue that on a mobile device, we're not going to see the hover effect. That's absolutely right. But what if the user is using a desktop computer, but the browser is small? We should count for those scenarios as well. So take a look. See, when we hover over the plan, it becomes too close to the next card. Look over here. Oh, we don't want weird issues like that on our website. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we want to increase the gap between these rows. So back to the plans block, we applied a gap of 4 rem to columns and rows. Obviously, this is not going to work. So for rows, I'm going to use 8 rems of gap. And for columns, which appear on a white screen, we're going to have 4 rems of gap. Now take a look. So on a mobile screen, we have 8 rems of gap between these rows, and nothing happens when we hover over this card. Great. Now on desktop, we're going to have 4 rems of gap between these columns. Great. So we're done with this component. Just like always, now it's time to store its template somewhere in a separate file.